Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to see so many of you here with us this morning. We really appreciate your giving your time to help us expand the conversation this morning around the exhibition, The Unfinished Conversation, Encoding and Decoding. I'm Christine Bowen, Curator of Education and Public Programs at the Power Plant. I would like to thank all of the participants in today's program, including the artists who so graciously offered their time to be with us today, Jana Kumfra, Sven Augustingen, Sheila Keeley, and Zeneb Zadira, as well as Dr. Tina Kampt, professor at Barnard College, who came in from New York to join us, and poet Christian Campbell, professor at U of T, who will also be presenting a performance at the Power Plant in a few months' time. I would also like to express my sincere gratitude to Cass Banning, who teaches in the Cinema Studies Institute, University of Toronto, and Dr. Warren Critchlow, professor at York University, who are the moderators for today's panel discussions, but also collaborators in shaping today's program, authoring publication descriptions, getting the word out to colleagues in different forums. They were instrumental in bringing the symposium together today and making it a success. So my heartfelt thanks to you both. I would also like to thank Mark Seeley and Autograph ABP for partnering with us on this program and the exhibition, The Unfinished Conversation, Encoding, Decoding, as well as our presenting sponsors for the exhibition, Band and TD Then and Now. Also, support donors, Lonty Ebers, Yvonne and David Fleck, James and Margaret Fleck, Dr. Kenneth Montague and Ms. Sarah Aranja, Diversity Art Forum, and of course, BMO for supporting our all-year, all-free access to the exhibition. I would especially like to thank our primary education sponsor, without whom none of our public programs would be possible, CIBC, for their ongoing generous support for all of our education and public programs. As well as my appreciation and gratitude to TD Bank for providing support for our TD Curator of Education and Outreach Fellow, Adrienne Costantino, whom I also thank for all of her hard work in bringing this symposium together. I would also like to thank our friends at the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, and the Toronto Arts Council. So thanks to everyone for your generous support. Today's program is divided into several segments. Each of these will begin with a conversation between the program participants, and then we will open up the floor to our audience for your questions and your comments, and we hope to encourage a lively exchange of ideas. Additionally, we value your feedback. So at the end of the sessions today, we will be distributing surveys, and we would really appreciate it if you could fill these out and deposit them in the box outside before you leave today. This helps us continue to bring these types of programs to you, improve them, and demonstrate their value to our generous funders. So we appreciate your help with that. I also invite you to join us for a reception at the Power Plant following today's talks. The galleries will also be open, so if you haven't had the opportunity to view all of their works in their entirety yet, you can spend time in the exhibition as well. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Gaëtane Verna, Director of the Power Plant, and Mark Seeley, Director of Autograph ABP, who will speak to the curatorial process behind the exhibition, The Unfinished Conversation, Encoding, Decoding. Please join me in welcoming them.
So good morning, everyone. It's really such a pleasure to see everyone here this morning. It is Saturday morning. And for those of you who were here last night at the opening, it was a glorious moment. And once again, I really want to thank the artists, all of whom are here today, for their trust and the amazing work that we all did together in order to bring forward this exhibition. So right now, what Mark and I are going to do is we're just going to have a very open discussion, a conversation in order to give you some insight on how this project actually came about and in which context we wanted to curate this exhibition. And we'll have 10 minutes at the end of our conversation to take questions, and there will be mics for you for everyone to be able to hear your questions. So the first thing I would like to start with is to tell you how I started at the Power Plant in March 2012. Prior to that, I used to work at in my career, I've always worked outside of the center. I first worked at Bishop's University, which is in the Eastern Townships, 2 hours away of east of Montreal, and for 8 years. And then I worked at Musée d'Art de Joliette, which is 75 kilometer east of Montreal. What that taught me was in both of these environments, I was often the only person of color, in these environments. I mean, not the only one, but they were predominantly white environment. And the thing that I learned from these experiences was that whatever I chose as a director or as a curator to present to those communities, there was never any throwback at saying, like, why are we seeing an exhibition of, artists of color or people from, different parts of the world within a context where there were no representation of these people. And that gave me a lot of trust in the ability to engage a diversity of people within subject matters that are relevant to all of us. It's okay? All right. And so within this context, when I began working at the power plant, it was really interesting for me to look at the history of the exhibitions and to also look at, the type of people who actually come to the gallery and or people that feel engaged in the gallery or feel that we could be a space where we could open the doors and engage people and enable them to cross a threshold of the gallery and to engage with any types of arts that we would present. Having said this, I get an email from a colleague who says there's an amazing work that was just premiered in Liverpool in 2012 at the Liverpool Biennale, and the title Unfinished Conversation by John Akumfra, amazing work, must see. And of course, I read up about the work, and my next question is like, how can we get this work here in Toronto? Because of the history, the link with Stuart Hall and the context of the work, I thought Toronto was the perfect environment to have the people engage with this work. And having said so, found out that Mark Seeley, who commissioned the work, was actually in Toronto working with Ryerson Images Center on an amazing exhibition called Human Rights, Human Wrong. So henceforth, we met, and I said to Mark, how can we work together to bring this work? And what was great was that because of our common interests, without ever having met each other, it's as if we had known each other forever. And I think that has shown itself through the entire process of this exhibition on how we could bounce off ideas between each other, and totally, even if I didn't know one of the artists that he was proposing and vice versa, there was this ability to connect and communicate. And we both, I think, share this vision of expanding the conversation and move it away from a racialized position while still engaging with these questions of identity, diaspora, migration. So Mark, what I would like you to tell us now is if you could, because I think it would be great for people to understand how the work of that you commissioned John to do, what's the history behind that work and how did it come about? And then from then on, we can move to giving you an insight on the works that we've chosen in the show.
Okay, well, it's, obviously I've been working with Stuart for a very long time, around about, I suppose David A. Bailey introduced me to Stuart, I think around about 1987. I think within the kind of context of that political time, there was a lot of movement, let's say, in terms of the artistic community that was out there, and especially the questions about who was making work and why they were making work and who was being supported. I mean, the work that John has done at Black Audio Film Collective and Smoking Dogs is, of course, immensely important to the kind of cultural scene around the UK. And obviously, there's a network of people that were in dialogue with John, and Stuart had been in conversation for a very long time. I've been in conversation with Stuart for a very long time. And in 2002, I realized that we were on a kind of end game with something. I'll expand on that a little bit later. Stuart made a decision that we would work towards trying to produce a building. I had a meeting with Stuart, and I said, yes, Stuart, but this question of buildings is really important, but so is this question of the visual, and you've been so influential to so many artists. I think it'd be really important if we actually put you in the frame, literally. And we decided that that would be so, I mean, Stuart would be, you go, yeah, well, fine, Mark, whatever, but we got to do these things. But it was something I didn't really want to let go of in terms of making a project. I suppose best part of 8 years later, again, Stuart was moving outside of becoming chair of Autograph and chair of Innova, and this thing called Rivington Place that we built kind of taxed a lot of us, a lot of funding, a lot of meetings, a lot of institutional kind of garbage, really, that you have to twist around to get things off the ground. And of course, there was a massive investment through Stuart in this space. Somehow he becomes this conduit that the state trust. We have this, almost this, I suppose, this charismatic figure that can turn a whole room round to get funding on the table, to see the value of things. John's work with Smoking Dogs, of course, we were discussing. There'd been, a new project out that John had done, which was, of course, very successful. And because of the complexity of John's work, it was almost a no-brainer that, we would try and get John to make this film with us. And of course, I remember the conversation that we had. It was in a corridor, because that's how we do our thing. And there was a few exchanges, probably with the F word in there somewhere, which said, of course, we'll try and get this thing done. And it was, yeah, let's try and make it happen. Stuart was incredibly open, many conversations across the kitchen table. I guess I really wanted the thing to happen while Stuart could participate in that thing. I think we all agreed that it was absolutely necessary not to make some kind of post-mortem biopic, but he had an influence on the thing, so it was great that we could sit up in his kitchen at times and just say, this is where it might be going, and at times he would say, well, I'm not sure about that. And I think the kind of task that John had, the difficult task that John had, was to try and weave through, the massive kind of complexities of Stuart's life and produce something in the archive, if you like, that would resonate. And we always had this idea of a kind of kaleidoscopic thing, a multiplicity of things, that 3-screen installation. That was also driven partly by the access to the types of funding that was out there. This was going to be a film, but not a film. This was going to be a film that was aimed at art galleries. It was like, how do we fund this thing? So we kind of maneuvered through a variety of different strategies to make the funding available. And then really, in all honesty, John and the team, Lena and David, did their work, and we machined it through, almost through to the last moment that we got to Liverpool. And then the results were pretty self-evident. I think I've often been quoted as saying we kind of nicked the Biennale. I don't think people expected it to be so successful. It was at the Blue Coat Gallery. The Biennale people were very kind of close to it. They came on board very late. And, there's the thing behind this is that there's so much trust being put on the table from places and spaces, trusting in John's vision, trusting in Stuart as the subject, trusting in Autograph. And that's because we had time on our side. There's been enough work done in the past so that people could see the value of the investment in the now. And that's part of getting older in the sector, I suppose, that there's a degree of, you can have those conversations. And in terms of the conversations that we had, what was refreshing about that is that you could actually have a conversation with someone and say, do you know what I mean? And they knew what they meant without having to explain everything at 100 mile an hour. This is probably the most economic conversations in terms of producing an exhibition that I've ever had, because there was a kind of synergy and understanding of what it is that we wanted to kind of achieve. And maybe that's because of the relationship that those two spaces have, London and Toronto, have to dealing with these issues of difference and diversity. How do we look at that? What work that people like Ken Montague have been doing. Ken's a very old friend of Autograph. I think he's one of the first people to buy a photograph from Autograph way back in the day, started to invest in us. So this kind of ongoing backwards and forwards. Doina Popescu coming to Rivington Place. We met. She saw the show that I'd done in Santu Mofokeng. That brought me to Ryerson because she was in a place where she was understanding the kind of challenges of a new institution. So there was a certain sense of openness. And I've often, if people say to me, what is Toronto like? I say it's a city that you can actually do things in. Yes. I mean, London is a very particular beast. It's very hierarchical. It's very celebrity orientated. It's got its dealer scenes. It's got its Uber stars. It's got, this certain sense of kind of control about it. It's got its gatekeepers. And kind of what I suppose I was saying about Stuart really is that he was one of those people that enabled us to open the door. And what I wanted to make sure, because of our relationship with him, is that we kind of tried to visualize his space. Academically, he's a global phenomena. But in terms of how we actually visualize that space, that was the challenge of this piece. And obviously taxing John to do that was a no-brainer. So that's how it really came about.
So from then on, now you understand the context of our conversation. And then so from then on, early on it was like, do we show the unfinished conversation as one piece that is shown as an exhibition with just one work? Or do we put it within a context where we can bring other artists whose work are also dealing with the archive, with archives, documents, and how these artists, in the very same way that John did it, how they transform the medium, the original archive, into an artwork. Because I think that's the beauty of that exhibition and the difficulty of working with such documentation in order to move away from the documentation and create the space of the artwork. What was interesting in our conversation was that we would, bounce off ideas of works, and often there were works. Even before I started at the power plant, I wanted to show the work of Sven Augustingen, titled Spectres. And again, this question of, do you show this work as a one-off, or do you integrate it within a larger context? And automatically, when we started talking about the exhibition, I said, you have to see this work by Sven Augustingen. And so then Mark, you called him up
Showed it in London.
Showed it in London, which also gave him an opportunity to see the work, and then that was done. Yes, this is, we've already found another work. Who else did we, you came up with Zeneb's work?
Well, yes, Zeneb's work. The piece on Kwasi was a really interesting intervention with the archive, and those historical documents been unfolded through the narrative of his partner's story, of course complemented the idea of trying to focus on works that put the individual and the individuals who live a life in politics was a kind of underlying kind of theme, I think, which was beginning to surface, not necessarily up front as a big kind of curatorial idea, but that began to so we had Lumumba,
yes,
then we had Kwasi,
with Sven,
then we had Stuart, obviously. So then to begin to expand that question, things began to bolt together quite nicely, I think, at that time.
I think also there's, in putting together an exhibition, there's the works that initially you want to present, and for some reason you realize you can't present, and then at the end you realize that the works that you've chosen not to present actually have enabled you to better conceptualize the exhibition. So Sven's work really deals with Patrice Lumumba, another amazing figure, and basically the whole story behind his death. And then we move on to, of course, there was, when I looked at the work of Sven, I thought of Steve McQueen. But then the question is, which work by Steve McQueen would you present? Because we could have gone easily to his work called Gravesend, which talks about the Thatcherism, which also talks about mining of coltan. But then we thought, this is too linear. And then you go see an amazing exhibit. I went to see a show at the Art Institute of Chicago, a big retrospective of Steve McQueen, and then fall upon the work and credit, which talks about Paul Robeson. And as soon as I sent the images to Mark, we said, this is the work to show, because then again, we have Steve McQueen using the FBI files, but how do you transfer such documents and make them into an artwork? And to me, it seemed like the perfect work that brought in, yet again, another figure, the figure of Paul Robeson, into the forefront. And also realizing that there's an entire generation of people who don't know who Paul Robeson is. And then incidentally, we didn't know this, but then we find out that that Steve McQueen, is working on a feature film on Paul Robeson. So I think it's really interesting for the public to see an artwork that speaks of Paul Robeson, to be in that space, and then after, you know, later on we'll move into the film, the feature film that
But again, this
Steve
question
will
of the state, the role of the state in politics.
Yes.
Because I mean, what Steve's work does is it just highlights that degree of Cold War paranoia that's at play. I mean, we have, you know, the theatre of the Cold War in Algeria, the theatre of the Cold War in the Congo, the theatre of the Cold War in London. So again, another underlying theme was in that. How do these people sit politically, and how do they sit within the state? I mean, one of the things that Stuart always said was, you know, we're both in and of the state. How do we work both in it, and then the very fact that we're of it? And it's a kind of complex set of contradictions in many ways. So those roles about what the state was doing to people like Robeson, the degree of paranoia, and I think, you know, 6 hours of kind of, you know, credited kind of information around that, you can't help but walk away and think, well, how much scrutiny, you know, how dangerous really was Robeson just for speaking in a moment of time that was about, you know, freedom, democracy, and, you know, the paranoia in the West really about so-called transgressive kind of characters, if you like that Robeson possibly represented. And if you like, the power of race in that space, you know, how dangerous it was to speak up for someone like Robeson.
Yeah, and it's interesting, this morning I went back to the gallery, so in the Steve McQueen work, the images are off, but the sound keeps running, and it's so interesting to be in the space and just listening to the you know, the voices that are actually reading some of that documentation. And, you know, thinking of voice, it brings me to one of the artists that we were both interested, with whom I had worked before, Vasco Araujo, who's a Portuguese artist. So initially we wanted to integrate Vasco within the exhibition, and then, you know, we just realized like not enough space in order to bring his work. But again, to give you, the public, an insight, I had worked with Vasco, I was showing his work at the power plant, and then I introduced Mark to him, and now Mark is going to do a project with Vasco in London. So again, this exchange of ideas also brings other projects to the forefront. In the same way, often when you're working on a project, you meet other colleagues, and I was talking to Franklin Sermon, who's at the Los Angeles County Museum, about our project, and he said to me, you know, you should really talk to Terry Atkins, who's an amazing artist who was teaching at Penn State University. So off we went to Brooklyn to meet Terry and to look at his work. And Terry's work is all about creating artworks that are monuments to African-American figures that he feels were never celebrated. So as much social, political, musicians, different types of artists. And I kid you not, on a small laptop, he shows us this work titled, what's the title of the work? Flumen Arenas. And I'm totally overblown by this work because basically you have these black and white images from the earliest 20th century that are showing you dirigibles and hot air balloons. And the text that he's chosen to put on the forefront is the speech by Martin Luther King, "Why I'm Against the Vietnam War." And the music in the background is the music of Jimi Hendrix. And then I find out, which I never knew, that Jimi Hendrix was a parachuter. So, and when you look at the work of Terry, and you know that Terry was also a musician, and you see how the rhythm of the voice of Luther King, and how the images are moving back and forward, and how you have the music of Jimi Hendrix, once again, you have an artist that takes all of these elements and then creates this other space within, you know, by creating this artwork. And I introduced his work to Mark. Mark had never heard of Terry.
Couldn't believe it, actually. Someone like Terry Atkins had just dipped right under the radar, which
Exactly.
says an awful lot about how artists like Terry are
That's it.
circulated in the world.
So, and then the first time I met Terry, he said to me, there's this amazing poet who teaches at University of Toronto, Christian Campbell. You know, we have to do something with him. So once again, you know, it's this combination of meeting people, of discussing, and also this trust that early on comes to the forefront. So the last artist also that we integrated was Sheila Keeley. So Sheila Keeley is a well-known artist from Toronto who lived in New York for many years, really known for her wall drawing and how drawing, mark making, and also movement is really integral to her work. I'd already spoken to Sheila about doing a work in the large clear story of the power plant, and which was a huge, huge undertaking, right, Sheila? And then, you know, as a curator, I go, oh, how about if you did one wall and then you did another wall? And then as I'm telling her about our project and how in her work, politics has always been integrated in it, but not on the forefront as something that you could, you know, she doesn't write, this is political, but if you dig on the subject matters that she chooses to bring forward, that notion of the politics and race is also embedded in her work. And she told me that in the 1980s, she had traveled to Africa, and specifically in the region that was called Stanleyville, which is now called Kisangani. And so she went through her archives and came up with these incredible images of colonial Belgian architecture, modernist architecture, and knowing what's been happening in that specific region in the last 20 years and how many of these buildings have disappeared, meeting somebody like Raoul Peck and having a discussion between Sheila, Raoul, and myself, and Sheila telling him about his work, her work, and him saying, you absolutely have to show this photograph, then Sheila came into the forefront, and we chose to present, you know, in a very cinematic way, a series of photographs. And when Sven saw those photographs, he was floored by them. So it's also this notion that the artists have work on multi-level, and some people were amazed that this could be Sheila's work. And I think it's also important for people to understand that artists do many things at the same time and should never be boxed in, you know.
True.
So I think that, you know, that gives you just really an overview of what the show is about. It's an exhibition that I encourage you to go see, and luckily for us, the gallery is free because you will need to come back. The works are very long. They're not works that you just digest, you know, automatically like that. And so I really encourage you to go back and come back. And we've put together a lot of public program in order to create bridges with the works. So now we're ready for questions. And I think there are 2 mics. Is it too early in the morning?
We should have planted a couple.
Christine, do you have a question?
Yeah, actually, Mark, you spoke to our gallery yesterday when we were speaking in conversation. You spoke a lot about about the theories of Stuart Hall and how they permeate this exhibition. Can you speak about that a little bit in this context?
Yeah, I mean, the theories of Stuart Hall, I mean, I think we have to recognize that, you know, this is someone who invented the term Thatcherism. This is someone who, you know, people like Tony Blair were absolutely fearful of. This is someone who put kind of cultural studies on the map. This is someone who enabled lots of people to start thinking about the power of the medium and who writes history and who translates it. I mean, we don't have, I mean, there was a conference just the other day at Goldsmiths which unpacked Stuart from a multiplicity of different kind of like political theatres. So the most important thing, though, is this sense of kind of, you know, being on the left and providing, as I said before, providing, if you like, an intellectual framework where you can begin to build things on that made sense, that enabled us to say things like, you know, the end of the essential black subject. I mean, what a fantastic thing to say, but, you know, kaleidoscopic conditions of kind of like being. The idea that you can begin to kind of unpack yourself, not through the prism of how other people are framing you, but through the prism of understanding that it's okay to be more than the sum of how it is that you're framed by the world outside. His work in media, his work in photography, and his work in the visual arts is just one chapter in his work. And in another project that we're doing at Autograph is talking about missing chapters, missing histories, missing narratives. And that's also through the prism of Stuart's work on the whole idea of the colonial subject and the post-colonial subject. But always within, I think, Stuart's first essay on photography is something way back in like 1971, his writing on Picture Post, kind of deconstructing this space, which is why I think kind of like tagging this encoding, decoding kind of point within it. He kind of always allows us, has always allowed us to think about what is power doing? How does power operate? And I think that sense of once you understand that we are all caught in these kind of moments of power, then through Hall, as I said, it's enabled a generation of people just to begin to undo some of those threads, to make an intervention into that space. So that's why I think it's still incredibly relevant. And actually, the more I reread Stuart in that sense, the more relevant it becomes, especially in this moment in time. It's almost as if it's kind of something that needs to be reconsidered again in light of what's been said now, or in light of the wider political concerns that we have now.
Can you speak about that in relation to some of the specific works in the exhibition?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I hinted at it before. I mean, one of the things I was keen to think about when we were looking at this exhibition is what does it mean to live a life in politics? The risks that people take, the things that get turned around or off, the way that history is articulated. And I think, in particular, I mean, I'm of course fascinated by the Congo. I mean, it's an amazing kind of horrific story and still is. How do we begin to understand that? Patrice Lumumba and, as I say, the theater of Cold War politics, played out in that space. Algeria, its relationship as a space, as an idea. Fanon, the whole idea of the kind of, a kind of Martinican working in Algeria, the whole question of Pan-Africanism, the question of the Panther, the Black Panther relationship to those spaces, the kind of global interconnected threads of those political forces and what was potential at that time and how much of a threat all of those kind of possible political moments represented. The organization of African unity, Nkrumah, and a kind of Pan-African vision. These were real ideas. 1963 is not just King and the Civil Rights Movement. It is also, Africa thinking about itself as a possible space. Bandung, Suez. It's an amazing kind of time. The world was really in turmoil. For the first time, one could argue that the South was beginning to have a kind of real political presence. Latin America, Central America, revolution was alive. There was real possibilities. Within there, you've of course got CND, sexual politics is kind of all over the place. It's an amazing time to be a political thing, but what huge risks. And in many ways, I could argue that we might have lost that space because the ideological kind of conflicts and the power of the right, Reaganism, Thatcherism, almost destroyed many of those kind of ideals and ideas. And through this show, I think you can inquire a huge, rich seam of kind of political inquiry, which can enable, I think, an audience maybe just to think about history and time differently.
This is a very large and complex exhibition, not just in its historical content, but also in its form and its aesthetics. And it seems to me that this exhibition is not one that is simply made to be seen, but also heard. Mm-hmm. And so you have a really interesting architecture around the building of this exhibition. And one of the things I worried about quite early was these pieces need to be heard. How is the exhibition going to be structured so that people can actually listen? And last night when we went through, I was so pleasantly taken by the fact that you could hear these pieces so well, and that you can hear them, in fact, resonating off of one another in a very interesting kind of way. So I'm wondering if you two can talk about your collaboration in terms of the actual design of this exhibition and what the design of the exhibition means. How does the design itself reflect, the bringing together of this transcontinental conversation that you two have been having, and also the kind of ideas that allow these works to work together as a kind of collective?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and really at the heart, I mean, I would say that, first of all, you need to take each work individually and figure out what are the needs of each work, in which context, which scale they need to be presented. And then one of the things I was also worried about is that if you say that this exhibition is like, 5 videos and then 1 wall work, how do you make this be, not linear, but that as a visitor you can engage with each of the work and then also feel the thread of the whole exhibition. And I think basically what we did, we started working with the needs of each of the work, working with the floor plan of the gallery, and that's where, our head technician, our assistant curator, and all of the technical requirements, and working with the artists to find out what do they need, and then how do we map out the space of the gallery in order to enable each of the work to have their individual space, but also to be communicating with each other. And and that's why yesterday I was making the comment about how when people think that showing video is easy, it's actually much harder than anything else, is that you have to make it look seamless. And in order to create that, there's a lot of the structure of the gallery being modified, having, sound panels, having, creating rooms within rooms, and then also creating a smaller space, even though the space of the gallery is much larger. And then mapping out, which work is the first work we begin with. We could have And then, so the size of the work and the flexibility of the work also enables us to do that. The other thing is, for instance, Terry's work was originally supposed to be shown on a really small screen with headphones. And both realizing this is not what we think is the best thing for the work. Then the artist dies, and we're trying to figure out, how do we convince, his family to say that our vision for the work is the right work. And in the end, it's again about trust and mapping out. So a few meetings, going to London, Mark coming to Toronto, being in the space, mapping it out, working with our different technicians, working with the technical directors for the different artists, and then making sure that everything works and there's a certain cohesion. I don't know if there's anything you would like to add on this.
No, but I think, obviously you have to work with the space and all the rest of that, but I think there is a dialogue across the work. You can't structure the path that people will walk into a space. But I think, you can begin with Zeneb, or you can begin with Sven's work, or indeed with John's work. But I think once you begin the relationships, I think once you've done the circle with the work, you'll be in a very, hopefully. I only like to curate shows that are kind of, and it sounds very old-fashioned, but I like the idea of transforming something. I like the idea of bringing something to the frame that hasn't necessarily been seen, not necessarily been seen before, because I don't like that discovery thing. At Autograph, we talk a lot about, well, what's the point of doing it if it doesn't actually change the game in some shape or form? That's what we're there for. We did a show called, Black Chronicles recently, which kind of had 12,000 people through the door. For us, that's a huge audience in many ways. The reason why? Because these portraits from 1869 of South Africans in London were so relevant to the audience that it meant that, for example, for the first time, people could see themselves in a very different light, and by seeing themselves, seeing their historical projection into that space. Home learning was going on in that space. People were bringing their kids and talking about the work, and I think this show will have a massive capacity to do that kind of work as well. So I'm quite old-fashioned in that way. I do like the idea that we have a responsibility to an audience, and if it fails, such is life. But, my line, and I think we share this, is that the politics of the thing, with a capital P, it's okay to be upfront with that, okay? It's not like making banners and all the rest of it. So the journey through the design of the work is, of course, important, but I think whichever way you go into that journey, at the end of this show, I'm hoping that there's some transformative moment gone on. And if that happens, then there's a degree of success within the exercise. And then we've done the artists at least some kind of justice in the things that they want to talk about through their work.
Yeah, because you can actually start from either from Terry or from Sven. And what's amazing is that when you listen to all of these works, when you see all of these works, there's connections between them. As we're looking through Zeneb's work, and Zeneb, Kwashi made reference to Lumumba, to Fanon, and it wasn't planned in that way, but we knew each individual works, and then the whole notion of between Lumumba and Robeson, and all these voices of these incredible, eloquent speakers, and I think in John's work, having the poetry of the jazz and also all the music that he brought forward, and the Virginia Woolf and William Blake. So it's really interesting that as much as it's about images, it's a visual art exhibition, it's about images, but it's as much about sound also, and voices, and making sure that the voices are in conversation. And I think Christine is telling us that this must be
We're
the
done.
end. We're done.
We're overcooked by 3 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mark and Gaëtan. And you two will be joining us in the audience here, and so we'll be able to continue the conversation with the curators while we're having the Q&A component of our panel presentation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.